Every species shapes the world around them. They act in a way that benefits or even creates the ecosystems they live in. Trees create shade and drop their leaves to help build soil. Birds plant the trees they'll eventually eat by just pooping their seeds wherever they go. And even the presence of parasites can help create more biodiverse ecosystems. By and large, most species behave in some way that leads to healthier, more resilient ecosystems. And then there's us, who more than any other species have the ability to shape the world into anything our imaginations can dream up, and we use that endless imagination to play golf and build roads. We've created a world in which the majority of everything we do is increasingly exploitative and destructive, and we've gotten so good at it that now we'll all have the privilege of getting to watch the entire world's ecology unravel in real time. But in spite of that, our potential as a species isn't what most people think it is. Despite the cynical voice that says we're doomed to destroy the planet, the reality is that we are capable of leaving the world better off than we found it. It is possible to feed ourselves and improve ecosystems. Because just like almost every other species on the planet, humans have a generative role to play in their ecosystems. And the reality is that if we could return to behaving like the wild animals that we are, nature would thrive. So that's what this video is about. It's about two kinds of rewilding. The first being the ecologic framework we're using these days to regenerate habitats back to the wild states they were in before humans started meddling. And the second is a rewilding of the culture and personality of nature's most influential ecosystem engineer, us. Let's start with ecologic rewilding. What is it? It's actually a bit hard to define because more than a concrete methodology with established techniques, rewilding is a broad approach to ecology, where even experts are split into camps where some think the term is a bit too fuzzy and needs a stricter definition in order to not dilute the ecologic potential, while others want to keep the definition vague to allow for creativity to flourish. Personally, I've looked at a lot of definitions, and the one I like best is this one from the book Rewilding by Paul Jepson and Cain Blythe. Rewilding is about restoring networks of interactions between communities of organisms and their physical environment, along with the ecological processes that emerge from those interactions. It's simple, vague, gets to the point, and places rewilding where I think it ought to be, which is a place in which the protection and reestablishing of relationships is at the center of the philosophy. At the end of the day, an ecosystem is just a fancy name for a collection of relationships. And rewilding understands that what destabilizes an ecosystem more than anything else isn't the loss of any individual species, but the loss of the relationships that those species have to one another. Once you lose bees, for example, you lose pollination, which means you lose fruit, which means you lose a source of food for bugs, and then the birds who feast on those bugs. So the loss of relationship cascades through the food chain. So what rewilding does is attempt to reintroduce the relationships that were lost in order to reestablish the resilience those relationships would bring. In this example, they might reintroduce a pollinator back into the ecosystem. Ideally, but not necessarily, that same type of bee that was lost in the first place. And like that, hopefully bring back the fruit, bugs, and birds. The difficulty has been that with so many species having been lost in so many places, it often isn't enough to just reintroduce a single species and hope that resilience and the stability of an ecosystem just return. So what's been developed in rewilding are a few models. The first is the 3 C's model, which I'm not really going to cover because its functionality limits action to ranges of land that almost none of us actually have access to, and because it was improved on by the model I am going to talk about. There is a lot to learn there, so if you're curious, you can Google for 3Cs rewilding or cores, corridors, and carnivores. The model I am going to talk about is the 3Ds model, which has the benefit of allowing rewilding to work at almost any scale and provides useful and lovely insight into ecology. As far as I can tell, the 3Ds model was first described in the article Rewilding Complex Ecosystems, in which the group of authors simplified rewilding down to 3 central ideas that help us understand what wilderness needs to be wild. The first D is dispersal. Dispersal referring to the capacity of nature to move freely, and that can be any type of movement of fauna and flora across space or time. So, practically what that can look like is the migrations of buffalo, the freedom of a squirrel to cross a road, a beaver to search upstream for suitable habitat for dams, or the movement of seeds and genes across the landscape. It can even be time-sensitive opportunities like a bird's ability to find adequate nesting sites at particular moments throughout the year. Essentially, nature needs to be able to move freely in order to follow their wild cycles and behaviors. And what rewilders would do is attempt to facilitate that movement. The next D, even though the authors of the article call it trophic complexity, is diversity. And what that means is just that wildness needs a diversity of species and structures to maintain the resilience of an ecosystem. Here, the goal might be anything that leads to a larger diversity of species, but also anything that leads to a larger diversity of types of ecosystems within a larger mosaic of habitats. By doing things like creating no hunting zones or compensation schemes in which farmers whose crops are damaged by wild animals are paid for their losses, rewilders provide positive pressure to help protect the establishment of that diversity. They also engage in things like species reintroductions, where certain species are brought back into an ecosystem, where particular focus would be given to species who have an outsized positive effect on an ecosystem, species that are deemed keystone or functional species. And quick definitions. A keystone species is one that is so integral to an ecosystem that it would be impossible for that ecosystem to exist without them. Think about wolves in Yellowstone pushing herbivores to hurry away from places long enough that they provide trees the time and protection they need to grow and then anchor sandbanks to change the flow of the river. Then there are functional species, who are species that provide a beneficial behavior within an ecosystem, which means that the difference here is one of scale. Keystone species have huge anchoring effects on an ecosystem, while functional species have smaller, but most of the time no less important effects. Think of a wren who eats some berries and then plants them upstream or somewhere else in their poop later on, or a fox who accidentally carries some bugs in their fur, which helps to mix bug populations and their genetics. Basically, the benefit of diversity is that through the grouping of all these small individual actions of each individual species, you discover a larger communal ecosystemic resilience. And then there's the third D, which for me personally has some of the most interesting implications later on, and that's disturbance. Disturbance is the idea that ecosystems are often built around and often are impossible without the disturbances that different organisms can bring to an ecosystem. Think about how the openness of certain savannas can only be created by elephants knocking down trees to bring light to the understory, or how the Nile created civilization through the seasonal floods that deposited fertile silts from upstream, or imagine an African grassland without wildebeest to eat, trample, and then poop on the grasses. These ecosystems wouldn't exist without those disturbances, which means that the stability of nature is often built on the timely disruption and destruction that nature's wild actions bring to an ecosystem. So we have rewilding, the methodology, which we can see is an ecologic framework in which we work to foster dispersal, diversity, and disturbance in order to help us restore networks of relationships between species. But that doesn't quite help us understand or define what wildness is as an individual concept, which I think is pretty important for understanding what it is we're even trying to get back to through rewilding. So, for most people, wildness seems to be one of two things depending on context. If we're talking about nature, wild is good. It's untouched by human hands. What we're reacting to is the idea that nature can exist without the direct care of people. So I think what we're calling wild here is a capacity for self-direction. But if we're talking about our friend's kid and we call them wild, what we mean is that they're not behaving as they should be, or that they don't yet know how to listen to adults. But more often than not in that situation, what I think we're reacting to is a state of childhood in which the kid hasn't yet allowed others to determine what it is they should and should not be doing. So I'd say that wildness here isn't either one of those things by itself, but connects to the healthier parts of both of them. It's the self-direction of wilderness and the freedom to be oneself of childhood, which means that wildness is what happens when one doesn't need to be controlled because they are perfectly themselves. And what that means when it comes to ecosystems is that wildness is a state in which healthy nature is allowed to express without any coercion from external factors. Which means that what the philosophy of rewilding is saying is that nature is no longer wild, meaning that nature doesn't have the capacity to self-express, and thus needs the interference from external factors in order to get back to that pure, wild state. Which is a strange kind of relationship because we've determined that what's going to help nature get back to a state of wildness where no interference is needed is the interference of a non-wild animal. And rewilding might be the best answer we have going for us right now when it comes to how to regenerate an ecosystem, but it's a relationship that I think leads to some problems that we're going to get into in part 2. There are a lot of people interested in rewilding that would argue that rewilding can only really be achieved by fully removing human influences from an ecosystem. They think that people are allowed to step in on occasion to ensure that nature stays on the right track, but by and large, that nature should be allowed to progress without our influence. What I'd like to argue, which is probably going to annoy some rewilders, is that nature can't be fully rewilded until human beings are reintroduced back into the wild. Because this idea that people live over here and nature lives over there, like some apartheid state, it's reinforcing the notion that people and nature are separate, as if humans are outsiders to nature whose natural habitat is an apartment building. And I think that has some negative consequences on our decision making. In some ways, making choices about wildness as an outsider, even when we go in with the best of intentions and science, can lead to the same ecologic pitfalls as not taking nature into account at all. Because the modern way we do things and wildness are often at odds. Modernity is about empowering the individual to shape the world towards whatever outcome they find economically, intellectually, or ecologically desirable. And when we engage in rewilding projects like that, what happens is that we start to force the ecologic outcomes we find desirable. We determine that one type of nature is better than another because we've got a few studies that suggest it, and then we make it so. We direct nature to fit our goals. But wildness is about connecting with and empowering the natural character of something, wherever that leads, even if it's uneconomic, seems stupid, or it's ecologically questionable. What matters is letting nature express and develop into someone healthy. And given that we live in a weakened world, nature isn't always capable of developing in the way that's necessary. And in those cases, it's up to us to be present enough in an ecosystem to understand when something's going awry, to be able to step in and do what we can to give nature what nature needs, especially since we don't really know what the ultimate wild state will look like, and it's going to take some navigating to get there. For example, Back in the early 80s, a lot of nature parks in South Africa were reintroducing the Big Five. And the result was that populations recovered, tourists came and helped fund the park, and things went pretty well for about a decade. But eventually they started noticing a lot of extra dead rhinos. And what was strange was that the rhinos still all had their horns, which made it very unlikely that it was going to be poachers that were the ones killing them. What they figured out eventually was that between 1991 and 2000, rhinos were being killed by young male elephants. And all of those elephants seemed to fit a particular profile. By and large, they were elephants who lived by themselves and suffered from PTSD from having lost their families to massive elephant culls before they were relocated. What seemed to be happening was that the trauma and stress of their life made it so that these elephants were entering into must a decade sooner than elephants usually do in the wild. Must, if you're not up to date on your elephant documentaries, is basically a super horny period of elevated hormones in male elephants during mating season. And what that meant was that when they went into must, which is already a moment of heightened aggression in elephants, they seemed to lose control of themselves and go on violent sprees in which they would kill rhinos. So after a decade of stability, we discovered a new missing piece of the puzzle to a healthy wild ecosystem. What they needed wasn't just more animals, it was an intact elephant culture and the healthy social bonds that brings to soothe and care for those young elephants. So what these parks did was to reintroduce a few older males. These older elephants were able to bring some guidance to the young males and normalize their must. And from that point on, with that piece of elephant culture rebuilt, the rhino deaths stopped. The point here is that you can't always just reintroduce a species and then hope things go back to how they were. Ecologic equilibrium is the result of countless generations of trial and error and refinement, and the complex interaction of relationships within or between species isn't just going to snap back to how it was. In many cases, the old equilibriums are gone, and we're going to need to discover new ones. Just looking at elephants, we've killed about 99% of them in the 20th century. Who knows how many pieces of their culture have been lost? And that's just looking at elephants. Now start looking at the thousands of species in any given ecosystem who've all been similarly harmed. And then start looking at the millions of interactions between them. Rewilding is going to need frequent interventions that stabilize ecosystems and rediscover something that's genuinely wild. And at that point of intervention, it's just called involvement. And if we're going to be involved in nature, we better understand wildness, and as much as possible, maybe even be wild ourselves. I believe that the closer we live to nature and the more involved we are, the better it'll be for everyone involved. But obviously there's a huge problem in my logic, and that's that the way we live is incompatible with the way that nature lives. Our priorities and natures aren't really in step, and if you reintroduce humans into nature as we are today, we'd probably behave just like those young elephants and start killing things for our own perceived safety. But it doesn't have to be that way. Despite how destructive we are right now, it's possible for humans to step away from the destructive paradigms that keep us in this cycle of ecologic suicide and to start living like healthy wild animals. Rewilding, among other things, is about the reintroduction of missing functional and keystone species back into an ecosystem. And it's about helping animals who aren't behaving wildly, like those young elephants, return to their natural healthy state. And I'd argue that at our best, at our most natural and healthy, there's no one as functional as a human being. People can be a keystone species. We are, after all, animals whose home and habitat is nature. We are wild animals whose dispersals and disruptions can benefit nature. But that begs the questions, how do we get there? Which I'm going to try and answer at the end of the video, and what does wild human behavior even look like? Which I'm going to try and answer now by saying, well, I'm not exactly sure, but I have some friends who might give us some clues. These are my friends. I mean, I wish they were. Beavers were hunted out of Spain 400 years ago, but little known fact about beavers, everything they do is awesome. They cut trees with their teeth that continue to grow throughout their lives so that they can keep sharpening them and are reinforced with iron. They build dams that they use to block up and slow rivers so that they can swim safely out of reach of predators through an amazing system of pools and channels. They store their food in little islands of branches underwater, using the water like a fridge. And what's interesting for this discussion on wildness is that despite cutting down so many trees and completely altering their ecosystems, the majority of beavers' actions actually result in a cascade of benefits. The result of all their work, all those felled trees, new ponds and water channels, is an explosion in biodiversity. The trees they cut allow for more light to reach a woodland floor that might have otherwise stayed so covered in shade that nothing would grow. Instead, all kinds of herbaceous plants spring up and new habitat is created for all kinds of little insects, amphibians, birds, and even other mammals. What I'm driving at is that it's clear when you look at beavers that what they're doing is shaping the world to their own benefit, and yet the result is a richer, more biodiverse, and more resilient space for everyone they come in contact with. And I think we've got that same potential. We can shape ecosystems in such a way that everyone benefits. All we've got to do to get there is to figure out what our own personal dams might look like. Obviously, most of us aren't going to be making actual dams anytime soon. I just think the question gives me a way to think about what a healthy wild relationship with nature might actually look like. Like, if we could entangle ourselves in an ecosystem so well that we improved biodiversity and helped dispersals, what would that look like? What would our disturbances be? What would we be making? Essentially, how can we be perfectly ourselves and allow nature that same freedom? What would our dam look like? If we look at beavers, the way they do it is by acting from a deep sense of purpose. It doesn't matter where they are or what's going on, they know exactly what they're here to do, and nothing's going to stop them. So, what would get you to act with that same level of purpose? What gift do you have to offer that you'd feel compelled to give no matter what's going on in the world, and that improves both your own life and the state of nature around you? I think Bill Plotkin puts it well when he writes, "The gift you carry for others is not an attempt to save the world, but to fully belong to it. You need to find what is genuinely yours to offer the world before you can make it a better place. Discovering your unique gift to bring to your community is your greatest opportunity and challenge." He says community here, and I agree with that, but you could have replaced it with the word ecosystem, and I'd still agree. If we're going to live out in nature, I don't think we need to live light on the land. I think we need to live so that we become a gift to the land. And figuring out how to do that should be as fundamental to rewilding as diversity, disturbance, and dispersal. But at the end of the day, very few of us are actually perfectly ourselves, and we won't become nurturing generative adults tomorrow. And in that context, this rewilding approach we've arrived at, where we keep our hands off to protect wild nature from people, makes sense, because we can't trust people to act with nature's best interest at heart. But if we did want to become involved, and if we wanted to do it in an authentically wild way, then I think we need to get curious about what's getting in the way of actually caring for wild nature, and what's preventing us from getting there. And that's what I'd like to take a look at next. It's hard to talk about what's blocking us from becoming wild because it's going to look a little different for each one of us, and any examples I give might be true for you but untrue for your neighbor. For some of you, it might be taking on projects that don't pay, while for others, it might be following a collective direction in which you are not a leader, or who knows what else. There's so many things that can get in the way of pursuing the wild directions we want to move in, or that nature might need us to move in, that we're not going to be able to get into here. But what I do want to talk about are a few of the larger mutual blocks that I think we're all facing and that end up stopping the majority of us from becoming wild. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, and each one of these individual topics merit a whole video written by people much more knowledgeable than I am, but what I'm going to try and do is boil them down to their base in order to trace our descent away from wildness. The first is simple enough. We don't have wild habitats to learn from anymore. It's been a long descent through thousands of years in which people have stepped out from the pristine wilds to now shape almost every corner of the world. And the result is that now most people don't have access to any wilds, and it's hard to learn how to be wild without wild teachers to learn from. Which is a bigger problem than it seems, because most people would think that the consequence here is that people aren't able to go for hikes and walks or spend time with nature. And spending time with nature is important for our mental health, which is true. But there's a deeper influence here, and it has to do with the way human beings are supposed to develop. Naturally, the way our lives are supposed to go is that we begin as babies in the safety and constancy of the arms of our parents, family, and friends. Over time, though, human beings are supposed to wander away from home and safety towards the uncertainties and dangers of wild ecosystems. There's an expectation written in our DNA that our formative years of learning how to be a human being will take place in wild nature. We're supposed to be learning about life and death by watching martens hunt rabbits, about safety from climbing trees, and presence from watching out for wolves. We're supposed to develop a capacity to handle discomfort from playing with nettle and hornets, and about the natural limits of growth from foraging the limited gift of blackberries. We're supposed to learn that we are nature by living in nature. But what we learn instead is that we can have whatever we want if we've got enough money. That the world is supposed to be a sterile, controlled, and domesticated place. Essentially, the lack of access to wild ecosystems interrupts our natural development from kids into adults who understand nature's logic and our place in the world. Without the wisdom that comes from a direct relationship with wild nature, we're a bit lost. And where that leaves us is locked in a world in which people who've never experienced a healthy wild state and are convinced that the way we are today is the way we're supposed to be, are making our choices about the future and about the wilds. And that leads into the second block I see, which is the hidden damage the absence of the wilds plays in our life. It isn't just that we're missing out on those important life lessons, it's that those lessons would help us grow into healthy, connected, and regulated people, which in turn would allow us to build a healthy, connected, and regulated culture, and not having them ends up resulting in pain, disconnection, and trauma. In the same way that a landscape's health can suffer when those 3 Ds are missing elements in our psychological and cultural landscapes can also lead to harm. In this case, I think the absence of those ecologic elements are messing with our natural and healthy development, making it so that we grow into people whose worldview and values create a culture in which hurting the planet and each other is seen as normal. And the problem is that it's happened so slowly over the course of generations that we've barely even noticed it happening, and little by little, the pain of missing ecosystems has led to a state of disconnection and trauma so commonplace that people simply accept the fractured state of the world as normal. And I want to be clear here. What I'm saying is that I think it's gotten to the point that you, me, and chances are everyone we've ever met is traumatized. And our decision-making has been corrupted by the symptoms of that trauma becoming generalized. Which might sound like a radical statement, and it probably is, but what's helped me understand how this happens is an idea about 2 types of trauma that I first came across in the book The Myth of Normal by psychologist Gabor. And since he explains it so much better than I can, I'm just going to let him explain it. There's capital T trauma, which occurs when things happen to vulnerable people that should not have happened, as for example, a child being abused or violence in the family. This is the type of trauma we're all familiar with, and the image most of us have for how to think about trauma. But there is another form of trauma, and this is the kind I am calling nearly universal in our culture, that has sometimes been termed small t trauma. Children, especially highly sensitive children, can be wounded in multiple ways by bad things happening, yes, but also by good things not happening. Trauma of this kind does not require overt distress or misfortune, and can also lead to the pain of disconnection from the self occurring as a result of core needs not being satisfied. Trauma, just to define it quickly, isn't the normal pain we experience by just living life. It's how we process that pain, or more importantly, how we don't process that pain after it happens. Trauma is unprocessed pain stuck in the body that leads to a fracturing of our psyche and relationship to the world. And small t trauma is the unprocessed pain of not receiving things we were supposed to receive, like in this case, positive interaction with wild nature, whose absence is a source of small t trauma. And I don't want to simplify the entire human psyche down to just saying that we're missing some trees and that's why everything's messed up. It's obviously way more complicated than that, but I do think that whatever the reason, we live in a highly traumatized world, and it affects the way we make choices. On a large scale, of course, but also on a small scale. It affects the way we rewild. People with trauma find it difficult to emotionally regulate or reach a state of feeling safe, and as a result become hypervigilant, looking for threats everywhere. They're less capable of cooperating with or standing up for others. They become less likely to think long-term, more likely to avoid complex problems, and become overly concerned with short-term goals. And in all of that, their fight-or-flight response can become hypersensitive. And where it used to take a pack of circling wolves, today it can get triggered by having to make a phone call, or designing a rewilding project in a way that's not guaranteed to earn an income, or simply having to confront a neighbor's judgment when we let our lawns go to flower and seed. We're at a point where daily life has begun to feel dangerous. Not because it is, we're technically safer than ever, but because we're carrying around so much trauma that basic discomforts begin to feel like existential threats. And our nervous systems are genuinely interpreting small problems like matters of life and death. And in that state, how could you stop to care about ecologic consequences? Nature becomes an afterthought. And what makes it harder is that when enough people think the same way, it becomes generalized to culture at large. And it starts to look normal to treat nature as a means to an end. And we make decisions in a way that aims to minimize risk instead of maximize connection. We use control as a way to get what we want instead of allowing authenticity to develop. And accidentally, we design for rigidity instead of wildness. And that state leads directly into the creation of the foundation on which the third large block, standing in the way of rewilding, is built. Colonialism. Here, I'm defining colonialism not as this great thing that nations do to one another, but as the individual state of each one of our lives as we live separate from or above nature. It's a condition in which we've begun to think that humans are above nature, and as a result, we stop recognizing ourselves as part of nature. And in that state of thinking ourselves above others, we quickly get to hierarchy, individualism, and a lack of relationship with both nature and each other, which breeds a paradigm in which power, coercion, and force become something worse than normal. They become expected. And the thread that gets us here is pretty straightforward. Colonialism is what happens when the trauma of being raised in an incomplete world leads to a chronic activation of a fight-or-flight response, which leads to a desperate state of trying to preserve our own safety and comfort over others, which leads us to feeling separate from everyone else. And all that together creates the motivating force behind colonialism, the perceived fact that the power we have as human beings to shape nature and each other to our whim is the only rational thing to do. Even when it comes to rewilding, when we forget our wild role as caretakers within a large web of relationships and instead convince ourselves that the best place for us to be is outside of everything, then it can impair the end result. It can lead to projects that can only exist if they make a profit, for example. Because apparently we're not creative enough to figure out how to protect nature unless people are paid enough to continue living among the comforts and pleasures of modern life. And it can make the pursuit of profit more important than caring for the natural wild character of nature. And chances are, that logic will continue to filter into our designs for as long as we maintain that colonial state of separation and control. But if that's the case, then I think practically we know enough theory about the ecology of rewilding. We know how to let nature take the lead by reintroducing species and working on those 3Ds. Obviously, there's still a lot left to learn and way more left to do, but we already have access to the information we need when it comes to strategies that work when we keep our distance. Where there's still a lot of work left to do isn't just in figuring out what happens when people begin to affect change and facilitate connections from within an ecosystem, but also how to get people over those blocks that are keeping them from actually engaging with the regenerative and rewilding initiatives to begin with. Which means that, strangely, some of the most important things we can do to strengthen ecology have almost nothing to do with ecology. They're working on the personal and cultural aspects of our behavior that have destructive consequences for nature. And a nice place to start here is in trying to fix those few blocks we just talked about, with the hopes that if we do heal them, we'll be opening a door that might one day let us become more personally involved in rewilding. First, we can't change that we didn't grow up in the wilds. Nothing replaces the lessons we didn't receive as children. The effects on our nervous systems are pretty much settled. But what we can do is to begin to attune ourselves to nature as we have it here with us today. Regenerate and rewild the lands we belong to, protect what we can, and hopefully provide the ecosystems we didn't have to future generations. And what that means on an individual level is to step in and help our local ecosystems, taking time to learn what we can about ecology and then listen and acclimate ourselves to the reality of our local ecosystems before we act. And doing it in a way that pays particular attention to how we care for nature. If we're going to foster an ecosystem that's genuinely wild, it might take more than just planting trees and reintroducing extinct horses. It might take challenging the fundamental values and structures you use to interact with nature, other people, and yourself. Because for most people, this particular type of interaction in which we're not in charge, or where we can't just buy our way to a solution, or where we don't get our way because we have to defer to someone else's needs, is difficult. And giving up the comforts of our lives to stop harming nature is difficult. Because having to take others into account like that goes against the basic colonial and individualistic way we've been taught to do things. It's so ingrained in us that, honestly, I don't really trust most people, including myself, to make those decisions about the 3Ds in a way that isn't self-serving. So I see two big ways to get over this block of a lack of wilds. The first is to do our best to plant and care for the proto-wilds we have today in the hopes that we'll be able to raise a generation of people who grow up with their capacity to understand wildness more wholly intact. And the second leads us right back to the next block. We have to heal ourselves enough that hopefully, to the best of our ability, we'll direct rewilding without bias or trauma. As we already talked a little bit about, trauma can sneak strategies of self-preservation into the way we make our decisions. As we try to defend ourselves from reliving pain from the past, it overwhelms us with its urge to guarantee our safety and protection, often at the expense of others. And the outcome is often that we might look at certain strategies for regeneration and rewilding as inviable because they don't cater to our need for safety and protection. For as long as our perception is that we're not safe in our lifestyle, strategies of mutualism or symbiosis that don't directly cater to that perceived safety will seem less viable. So, we can make what seem like positive ecologic or wild choices and be unconsciously perpetuating our trauma onto the natural world. And what that means here is that one of the greatest ecologic tools we have at our disposal is healing our trauma, to be able to feel and see things clearly. Because there's a greater chance that people with regulated nervous systems might be willing to inhabit a world that's a bit less safe if it means that nature is a bit better off, or consider courses of action that don't immediately guarantee their own personal safety if it means that they might someday be met by the improved health of the wild ecosystem. And again, I don't want to prescribe any singular path for how anyone should go about healing their trauma. That's bound to be personal and unique to you. But I do think there's a common thread we go through here that starts with accepting that our trauma is real, whether we like it or not, and accepting that that's going to be a long path towards healing those wounds. so that eventually we might be able to identify the particular shape of how it presents in you, understanding where the pain came from, figuring out how it affects your choices and relationships and how it sneaks into your decision-making. So that when it comes time to look at dispersal, diversity, and disturbance, you'll be able to trust that you're open to the choices nature needs, no matter what direction that takes you in, and you won't unconsciously guide nature towards your own comfort, safety, and convenience. The last thing I'd like to talk about here is that healing trauma makes space for direct relationships with others. Whenever we improve our capacity to look beyond our own needs, we strengthen our capacity to stop interacting with nature from a position of separation and authority and move towards a view in which nature is a living being just as in need of connection and the freedom to be wild as we are. And interestingly, that shift from separation to a relationship of equals erodes the foundation right out from under coloniality. Because once you can take an interest in the wild needs of others as an extension of your own, you erode the estrangement coloniality is built on, and you initiate a deep cultural shift. And I can't say exactly what's going to happen within that shift because I haven't fully gotten around that river bend yet, but what I imagine is a different paradigm. One where the individual separating, coercive, and controlling mandate of modernity, where we pull nature's strings and act like we're not part of the same world, fades. And a new relational, connective, permission-based co-creation of a shared planet can take its place. One where we understand that everywhere we go is a part of nature and that it deserves to be wild, not just the few designated parks, and that there's nowhere we can go to be outside of that. Which is why I think it's the responsibility of rewilding to not focus just on ecology, but to lay the groundwork for that new culture, where we foster changes out there in the world, but also in ourselves to be able to value what we want and what nature wants as equal. Construct a society that understands that the wilds are the natural habitat of the human being and work to develop the ecologic and social technologies of mutual support that might get us back there. That's capable of rewarding people for acting from self, deepening ecologic knowledge, and valuing caring bonds. And that moves us away from a reality in which people are fundamentally destructive towards one in which we return to our naturally generative and wild state. And I think each one of us has the potential to act from our little wild piece of the puzzle to grow wilder, richer, and more beautiful wilds. Or, in the very old words of Marcus Aurelius, don't you see the plants, the birds, the ants and spiders and bees going about their individual tasks, putting the world in order as best they can? And you're not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what your nature demands?